There are moments in a man's life when he stops being what the world has made him and chooses instead who he might actually be. These moments come unexpectedly. They don't announce themselves. They arrive in the guise of an ordinary afternoon. Blazing heat, dust rising from hoofbeats, a girl's face covered in blood from a man's casual backhand. And in that moment, with all the weight of law and custom and survival instinct pressing down on one side, a man reaches for his gun and says no. Just no. Not asking permission from history, not waiting for absolution, simply refusing to be the instrument of a cruelty he no longer believes in. Dalton Cord had spent 23 years learning how to follow orders. It took him a single moment beside a river to understand that he was no longer the kind of man who could do it. This is the story of Dalton Cord, and of a girl whose name he would never learn to say correctly, though the tribe would tell him it meant female warrior in their own tongue. The ranch sat 30 miles south of the San Pedro River, in country that belonged to neither the territory nor the tribes, but to something harder and older. The land itself, indifferent to all claims and flags. Dalton had purchased it after leaving the cavalry in 1878, spending the last of his mustering out money on 200 acres of scrub brush and saguaro, knowing only that he didn't want to see another uniform, or hear another order, or wake up knowing he'd failed his own conscience another day. He'd bought horses, good breeding stock mostly, and kept to himself, which was easy enough to do in the Arizona territory, where men respected a man's distance because they understood what it cost to maintain it. He was 42 years old when the Outlaws came. Tall and straight-backed, his cavalry posture still ingrained in the set of his shoulders, despite the civilian clothes. A dark brown leather vest over a white cotton shirt, tan riding trousers, tall cavalry boots he still polished out of habit. His hair was black with gray threading through it. His face was lean and scarred, a saber wound running from his left ear to his chin, a mark from his time as a younger man when he'd believed in the rightness of military action. His blue eyes were sharp and saw too much. His hands were calloused from years of work that had nothing to do with killing, and they'd learned a different kind of strength in the time since he'd left the army. Rafael Quintero worked the ranch with him, a Mexican horse handler in his 60s who'd seen enough of life to know what mattered and what didn't. They didn't talk much, but they understood each other in the way of men who'd both learned that the world was harder than any of them had been promised. The ranch had been Dalton's redemption, though he would never call it that. 200 acres of scrub and sage stretching south from the foothills toward the San Pedro, with water rights to a spring that ran cold and clean year-round. He'd built the main house himself, adobe brick and wooden beams, modest but solid, the kind of structure that would outlast him. The barn was larger than the house, because Dalton had always believed that a man's values revealed themselves in where he chose to invest his resources. 3 corrals for breaking and training, a separate breeding stable, miles of fencing that he and Raphael had strung together in the blazing heat of 1879, their hands bleeding through leather gloves, working in silence because there was nothing to say. The horses were his life now. 47 breeding stock when the Outlaws came, a mix of Mustang and Arabian bloodlines that Dalton had spent 5 years carefully developing. He'd gone to California twice to find the right studs, had traded for mares that most ranchers wouldn't have known how to value. His goal was simple: to breed horses that combined speed with the endurance to survive the territory's brutal climate, animals that could work all day in 100-degree heat and still have the will to run when it mattered. Some men collected gold. Dalton collected genetics. Raphael understood this without being told. Their daily routine was locked into the season. Summer meant dawn breaks at 4 in the morning, out to check the water sources before the heat became absolute. By 6, they'd moved stock to different pastures. By 8, the heat was too intense to work unbroken. They'd retreat to the barn's shade, do maintenance work, repair tack, study the bloodlines in Dalton's leather-bound notebooks. By late afternoon, when the temperature had peaked and begun its slow descent, they'd move the animals again, ensuring everyone had access to water before darkness. It was work that asked everything and offered nothing but the knowledge that you'd kept living things alive another day. What Dalton didn't talk about, even with Raphael, was what he thought about during those long afternoons in the barn's shadow. The cavalry camp in 1876. The order that had come from above, burn it, the colonel had said. All of it. The supplies, the temporary structures, everything that suggested the Indians had been there. It's how we deny them the ability to return, the colonel had explained, as if it made sense, as if history could be burned away. Dalton had been younger then, had still believed that orders came from men who understood the full moral weight of what they were asking. He was supervising the fire when he realized what they hadn't burned yet. The children. The ones who'd been separated from the main group, who were being held in a separate camp pending relocation. The ones no one had thought to mention in the original order. He'd refused. That was the word they used. Refused. Not disobeyed, not exactly. He'd simply stated that he would not participate. The order had come down to him, and he'd said no. It had cost him the cavalry, had cost him the life he'd been building toward, had cost him his place in history as anything other than a minor footnote, the young officer who'd made a fuss about something irrelevant. 30 years later, he still woke some nights with the smell of smoke in his nostrils, still heard the colonel's voice explaining that the children would be fine, would be relocated. It was just a precaution. He'd never learned what happened to them. He'd spent 5 years trying not to think about it, and another 5 years in the cavalry before finally understanding that every day he wore that uniform was another day he was participating in a system that asked men to accept orders that hollowed them out. So, he'd bought a ranch. He'd bought horses. He'd learned to work with his hands in ways that built things instead of destroying them. And he'd spent his mornings and afternoons and evenings learning to live with a man he'd failed to save. But he could save horses. He could keep them alive. He could give them the chance to become something other than what circumstance had made them. It wasn't forgiveness. He knew better than to think it was forgiveness. But it was something. It was a life. And it was his. The summer of 1883 had been brutal. The heat came on early and stayed late. The sky burned white at midday, and heat shimmer rose from the earth like the land itself was evaporating. Saguaro cactus cast thin shadows in the brilliant light. Mesquite trees hung limp in the breathless afternoons. Dust devils formed and dissolved across the desert floor. The brief monsoon rains came in July and August, churning brief storms that would blacken the sky and dump rain that the parched earth couldn't hold. Dalton loved it, this landscape that asked nothing and gave nothing, that matched the state of his own heart perfectly. He was checking the western pasture in late August, early evening when the light was beginning to shift golden, when Raphael rode up hard, harder than Dalton had ever seen him ride. "Outlaws," Raphael said. "South, maybe 3 miles. They have a girl." Dalton didn't ask which girl or from where. In the Arizona Territory, the facts usually spoke for themselves. He saddled his best horse, a dark bay with the kind of speed that came from careful breeding, and Raphael followed. They rode south into the growing darkness, toward the sound of men's voices and a horse whinnying in distress. The camp was set in a wash where a creek ran dry most months. There were 5 of them. Dalton knew their type immediately. Men who made their living by taking what others had built. Their horses looked good, which meant they'd stolen them recently and hadn't yet used them hard enough to show it. The men had a traveling camp rigged up, the kind that said they were moving through, probably heading south to sell whatever they'd stolen across the border in Mexico. The girl was maybe 10 years old, small, dark as mesquite bark. Her long black hair was in 2 braids tied with red cloth strips. She wore a beaded deerskin dress. Apache. Dalton recognized the beadwork pattern immediately. She had a cut above her right eye, fresh blood running down into her eye socket. She wasn't crying. She was fighting. One of the outlaws was holding her arm, and she was kicking at his legs, trying to bite, her entire small body rigid with rage and refusal. That was when Dalton understood. This wasn't just theft. This was going to be human trafficking. They were going to sell her south of the border to someone who'd use her until she was used up. The realization came with the weight of a second choice point in his life. The cavalry camp, 1876, the children, and now this. Except this time, he could act. This time, the moment belonged to him, not to someone above him in the chain of command, not to a colonel explaining orders as if explanation could justify anything. This time, he could choose differently. He watched the camp for a moment while Raphael positioned himself to come in from the east. The outlaws' routine was predictable. 3 of them sitting around a fire that was burning itself out, one checking the horses, one keeping watch in a lazy way that suggested he wasn't expecting trouble. The girl stood separated, surrounded by men who understood that children were easier to control through exhaustion than through restraint. Dalton could see it in her bearing. She'd been fighting all day, probably since they'd taken her. She wasn't tired yet, though. She was still moving, still resisting, still believing that fury and refusal could save her. He understood that kind of belief. He'd had it once. The cavalry had asked him to surrender it. This girl, this small Apache child with blood running down her face, had refused to surrender it even as 5 men worked to break her. In that moment, watching her kick and bite at her captors, Dalton made the choice that would ripple forward through everything that came after. The outlaw leader was a man named Virgil Slade, lean and hard-looking, the kind of man whose face said he'd made peace with being damned a long time ago. He had a revolver on his hip, worn and oiled, and clearly his primary tool. He saw Dalton and Raphael coming and simply smiled. "Well, well, company. You boys look like you came out here to cause trouble, but you picked the wrong men to trouble." He glanced back at the girl. "We're just doing some business here. I'd suggest you turn around and ride back to wherever you came from, and I won't have to put bullets in you." Dalton didn't stop riding. He rode straight toward the camp, and when he was close enough, he reined in the bay hard, the horse rearing slightly, the movement deliberate and controlled. He let his eyes settle on Slade, and something in his bearing, the set of his shoulders, the particular weight of his stare, the muscle memory of 23 years wearing the uniform of a cavalry officer, made Slade's smile falter just for a moment. "The girl goes with us," Dalton said. His voice was flat, not angry. Anger was a young man's tool. Now. You don't give orders here, old man. No, Dalton said. I'm not giving orders. I'm making you a statement of fact. In the next 10 seconds, you're going to release that child, and you're going to move back from this camp. After that, we all ride out, and you never see any of us again. You take a different road. You sell your horses in a different territory. You disappear. One of the other outlaws, a scarred man with only 3 fingers on his left hand, drew his gun. The motion was fast, but Dalton had already moved, his hand finding his Colt with the muscle memory of 30 years of cavalry service, before a scarred man's pistol had even cleared leather. Dalton's gun was up and aimed, and he'd already fired, the shot taking scarred man in the shoulder and spinning him backward. The gun dropped from his hand. Slade drew then, but he was slower, and Dalton shot him twice, once in the chest and once in the upper arm, the shots placed with cold precision. Slade fell to one knee, blood spreading across his shirt, his own gun unfired in his hand. "The girl," Dalton said again. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved from his spot. "Now." The outlaw holding the girl released her immediately. She ran straight for Raphael, who'd ridden in on the other side and was covering the camp. Raphael scooped her up in front of him on his saddle. Dalton kept his gun pointed at the remaining 3 outlaws, none of whom made any move toward their weapons. They were the type who understood hierarchy immediately. Without Slade or Scarred Man to follow, they had no authority to fight back. "You have about 5 minutes before your friends here start dying if they don't get medical attention," Dalton said. "You can either ride out now and head north, find a town, get them help, or you can try me and I'll kill all of you and leave your bodies for the desert. Your choice." They chose poorly at first. One of them reached for a rifle. Dalton shot him in the leg. The man fell, screaming. The other 2 immediately threw up their hands and started running toward their horses. Dalton and Raphael rode out at a gallop, the small girl clinging to Raphael's neck, her eyes wide but dry, her little hands gripping his shirt like she was willing him to move faster. They rode north, away from the camp, knowing that the outlaws were damaged but not destroyed, knowing that Slade was wounded but possibly alive, knowing that they'd just made enemies who might spend years looking for revenge. Dalton didn't care. He'd followed orders for 23 years and had learned something fundamental about himself. He was done. The girl was safe, and that was the only order that mattered now. They rode for 2 hours straight, the girl between Raphael and the rhythm of the horse, not a sound coming from her, except the soft rasp of her breathing. When Dalton finally slowed the pace, the small Apache girl turned and looked at him with eyes that seemed ancient in her child's face. She didn't speak his language. He didn't speak hers. But she nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement. Of respect, maybe. Raphael took her to a small adobe they found near the foothills where a Tohono O'odham family lived. They gave him water and food, and he explained in his broken Spanish-Apache hand signal combination that the girl was Apache, that she needed to be returned to her people. The family understood. They sent riders north in the darkness, word passing from camp to camp the way word traveled in the territory, through networks older than the territory itself, through relationships built on obligation and history that the white government didn't even know existed. Dalton and Raphael rode back to the ranch. There was a violence in Dalton's hands now, a shaking that came from the adrenaline of killing and the certainty that he'd just done something that would change everything. He kept thinking about the girl's face. She'd been fierce even while bleeding. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She'd fought. Every moment of her captivity, she'd fought. That night, after they'd left the girl with the Tohono O'Odham family and ridden back to the ranch under the first stars of August, Dalton found himself at his father's grave. He'd buried him there in 1878, on the northern edge of the property, under a cottonwood tree that had somehow survived despite everything the territory could throw at it. The grave was marked with a simple cross, his father's name, his dates, nothing else. Dalton's father had been a cavalry officer too, had believed in the rightness of military order and hierarchy. He died believing it. Dalton had never had the courage to tell him that the belief was a lie. He stood at the grave for a long time, not moving, not speaking. The night was so dark that he couldn't see his own hands in front of him, but he could feel them shaking. He'd killed 3 men tonight. Maybe. He'd shot 5, but he wasn't sure if all of them would die. He'd done it knowing that Slade would send men after him, that there would be consequences, that he'd removed the anonymity he'd been cultivating so carefully for 5 years. And he didn't regret it. The knowledge was strange and clarifying. He'd killed men before, in the cavalry, and he'd regretted every one. But tonight, shooting at outlaws who were going to sell a child into slavery, he felt something else entirely. He felt like he'd finally chosen correctly. Like the choice he should have made in 1876 was being remade now. Was being redeemed through action instead of just living with the ghost of refusal. He thought about the children from the camp, the ones he hadn't been able to save. He thought about where they'd ended up, whether they'd survived, whether any of them were still alive. He thought about the weight of choices made in the moment versus choices that haunted you for decades. And then he thought about the small Apache girl, about the red cloth strips in her braids, about the way she'd fought even while bound and outnumbered, about the certainty in her small body that fury and refusal were the only acceptable responses to captivity. She was going to survive. She was going to find her way back to her people. She was going to have a life that the outlaws couldn't buy or break or use. Because he'd chosen differently. Because in the moment when it mattered, he'd said no. Dalton walked away from his father's grave and returned to the ranch, not to sleep, but to sit in the barn with the horses, running his hands along their warm necks, feeling the existence of living things that depended on his choices. The horses didn't know why he was grateful. They only knew that he was there, that he was steady, that he was keeping them alive another night. It was enough. It would have to be enough. 3 days later, the tribe arrived. It took Dalton's breath away, not because of the surprise, but because of the sheer, cinematic weight of it. They came from the north, riding out of the heat shimmer on the horizon, materializing like a vision summoned from the desert itself. 12 riders, then 20, then more, until Dalton counted at least 50. Apache warriors and women and young men, horses moving in perfect coordination across the white-hot earth. The heat of August was relentless. The sky was a sheet of bleached white. Saguaro cactus threw spokes of shadow across the ground. Mesquite trees were visible as dark smudges in the distance. The dust of their passage rose behind them like smoke, the way dust moved in the Arizona desert. Slowly, reluctantly, as if the earth itself was dragging its heels about, revealing what was happening on its surface. They came slowly, not in a rush, not in anger. They came with the kind of deliberate pace that said they knew exactly who they were looking for and what they wanted to do when they found him. The leader was an old man, probably in his 70s, riding at the front on a dark horse with silver markings. His face was scarred and weathered. His hair was black still, streaked with gray. He wore traditional clothing, shirt and leggings that had been in families for generations, decorated with work that showed the depth of skill passed down through mothers and grandmothers. His eyes, when he finally came face to face with Dalton, were the eyes of a man who'd seen enough of life to understand it. Dalton had been standing on the front porch when they appeared on the horizon. Raphael was beside him, silent, his hand moving to shield his eyes from the white sun. They watched the riders emerge from the heat, shimmer like a painting, becoming gradually visible. First just forms, then gradually taking on definition. The colors came into focus, the reds and golds of traditional dress, the tan and brown of the horses, the glint of ornaments and silver in the sunlight. It was the largest gathering of Apache riders Dalton had ever seen, and he understood, without being told, that this was intentional. This was a statement. This was a people saying, "You did something that mattered. We see you. We respond." The lead riders slowed as they approached the ranch, moving from the hard gallop to a walk about 200 yards out. The entire group moved as one, not through any signal Dalton could see, but through the kind of coordination that came from people who'd lived their entire lives moving together, working together, understanding each other without words. Behind the warriors came women and children and young people, a traveling community expressing itself through movement. The horses, at least 30 of them that Dalton could count, were not the stolen stock of common raiders. These were quality animals, cared for, valued, bred carefully. This was not a casual visitation. This was a gift procession. The dust settled slowly around them as they stopped, gathering in the open area in front of the house. The lead rider, Chogan, raised his hand, and behind him, another rider appeared at the edge of the group. It was the girl, Lozen. She was flanked by two women who Dalton understood immediately were family. They had her face, her fierce eyes, her bearing. The girl's cut had been cleaned and tended. She wore fresh clothing. She looked small still, but whole, alive, saved. Seeing her, Dalton felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. The knowledge that a choice he'd made had created a future instead of just preventing a tragedy. The girl looked directly at him across the distance and nodded, the same gesture she'd given him the night of the rescue. "I see you. I know. I will remember." The old man dismounted, each movement deliberate and slow. He walked toward Dalton. Beside him walked a boy, young, probably 15, who translated, speaking in Spanish with an Arizona accent. "My name is Chogan," the old man said through the boy. "That is my granddaughter you saved. Her name is Lozen. We had been looking for her for 2 days when your message came through the network of the people. You gave her back to us without asking for anything. You risked your life for a child you did not know." Dalton didn't know what to say. He'd done what seemed necessary at the moment. The complications and consequences could come later. "I could not leave her," he said simply. Chogan studied him for a moment. He looked at the scar running down Dalton's face. He looked at the cavalry boots, the posture, the bearing of a military man. "You were army," Chogan said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, cavalry. I left." "Why?" Dalton was quiet. He thought about the camp in 1876, the order that had come down from above, the moment he'd understood that the uniform had asked him to become something he couldn't be and still live with himself. "Because I couldn't do what they were asking. Not anymore," Chogan nodded. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something, a leather pouch, worn and old, tied with rawhide. He pressed it into Dalton's hands. "This is our gift," Chogan said. 12 of the finest breeding horses we have, water rights to a spring on our land that runs year-round, and this, no one will touch your ranch again. The raiders, the thieves, the men who take what is not theirs, they will know that you are under the protection of the Apache people. That knowledge will protect you more than any gun." Dalton felt something break open in his chest. He didn't deserve this generosity. He didn't deserve the forgiveness implicit in it, the understanding that sometimes men had to refuse the world's orders to find their own humanity. Chogan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You chose right," the old man said in Spanish, not needing the translation. "When the moment came, you chose right. Not everyone does. Not everyone can. You can." The tribe stayed through the afternoon. Raphael brought out food, the best they had, roasted meat and dried fruit and water that hadn't been boiled, the kind of hospitality that said everything without words. The girl, Lozin, came and sat near Dalton for a time, and she showed him where she'd bound her own cut with strips of cloth, the wound already beginning to heal. She didn't speak, but she stayed close, and somehow that spoke louder than any words could have. As the sun began to set, the tribe prepared to leave. Chogan brought the promised horses, 12 of them, more beautiful than anything Dalton had ever owned, with the kind of breeding line that would transform his ranch. Raphael took the halters, tears streaming down his weathered face, understanding the gift for what it was. A statement that their work here mattered, that they'd done something that echoed beyond the moment. The girl, Lozin, came to Dalton one last time before they rode. She took his hand and pressed her forehead against his palm, a gesture he didn't know the meaning of but understood completely. It meant, "I see you. I know what you did. I will remember." Then she turned and mounted her horse with the grace of someone who'd grown up in the saddle, and the tribe rode north, back toward the mountains and the country that belonged to them, disappearing into the darkening sky the way they'd come, materializing and then dissolving, like they'd never been there except for the 12 horses that remained and the new knowledge living in Dalton's chest that sometimes, when a moment comes, a man can choose to be something better than what he'd been. But the girl didn't disappear entirely. Over the following weeks, Chogan sent riders with messages, with supplies, with news that Lozin was safe, that she'd recovered fully from her wounds, that she was asking about the man on the ranch. And in early September, before the heat finally broke, Dalton found her waiting at the edge of his property on a horse that was clearly hers, a younger animal, dark and spirited, with the kind of potential that spoke of careful breeding. She'd come to help with the horses. That's what she said to Raphael through a translator, one of the young riders who'd been left with her family to ensure communication. She wanted to see what Dalton had built. She wanted to understand his breeding program. She wanted to learn. What happened over the next month surprised everyone, including Dalton. The girl had a gift with animals that was almost preternatural. She could stand near a horse and understand its temperament immediately. She could predict which of Dalton's mares would produce the best stock, could see in the animals what was potential and what was limitation. She and Raphael developed a language of their own, gestures and hand signals, and the kind of knowing that came from spending all day together in physical work. She laughed with him, genuine belly laughs that seemed to crack open some part of her that the outlaws hadn't been able to touch. She showed him how to approach the horses the way her people did, with respect, with understanding, with the knowledge that animals were partners, not tools. And she changed what it meant to be on the ranch. Before Lozin came, Dalton had worked in the silence of guilt and redemption, the internal narrative of a man trying to build something beautiful out of the ashes of moral failure. But watching her work alongside Raphael, watching her laugh, watching her become lighter and stronger and more alive with each passing day, Dalton understood that he wasn't just saving something, he was helping something grow. The horses were better because of her presence. Raphael was better. The ranch itself seemed to understand that it had been chosen for this, to be a place where hurt children could come and learn to be whole again. The ranch changed after that. The horses transformed everything. Within a year, Dalton had a breeding program that attracted attention from ranches across Arizona and into California. He was no longer anonymous. He was no longer invisible. He was the man who'd chosen an Apache girl over outlaw gold, and the territory knew it. 5 years later, a young woman rode into his ranch. She was 17, tall and straight, with dark eyes that contained both fierceness and laughter. She had a beaded dress and a headscarf tied with red cloth. It took Dalton a moment to recognize her. "You gave me back my life," she said in Spanish, her accent carrying the music of her people's cadence. "Now I want to see if I can give something back to you." She stayed for a month, helping Raphael with the horses, learning the breeding stock, understanding the way Dalton had built something beautiful on the foundation of a single moment of choice. When she left, she carried with her the knowledge that one man's refusal to participate in cruelty had rippled forward into her own adulthood, giving her the freedom to become a woman instead of a commodity. And Dalton, watching her ride north toward the mountains with the morning light catching the red cloth in her hair, understood that the moment beside the outlaw camp had been the real beginning of his life. The cavalry, the uniform, the years of following orders that hollowed out his soul, all of that had been preliminary. This was the life that mattered, knowing that when a moment came, he'd chosen right, and that choice had echoed forward into the possibility of something better. In the years that followed, Dalton's ranch became known throughout the territory as something unusual, a place where Apache and Mexican workers lived alongside the white owner in a system that acknowledged everyone's dignity. It wasn't perfect. The territory was still what it was, still designed for extraction and violence. But on those acres south of the San Pedro, something different had taken root. The 12 horses from Chogan had produced bloodlines that were sought after from California to Texas. The breeding program had become the most successful operation in Arizona, and Dalton had turned down offers that would have made him wealthy beyond imagining. Wealth, he understood, was not what he'd been saving his life for. Lozin returned every summer for 5 years, bringing with her the knowledge of her people's ways with horses, learning Dalton's methods, becoming something between a student and a teacher. By her 22nd year, she had her own horse herd, descendants of the animals Chogan had given, improved through Dalton's genetics, strengthened through her instinctive understanding of bloodlines. She'd become a breeder in her own right, bringing horses and trade and connections between her people and the ranchers who had learned to respect what she knew. One morning in 1895, she rode up to the ranch one last time, not as a visitor, but as someone coming home. She was a woman by then, hard and kind in equal measure, with the bearing of someone who'd survived something terrible and chosen to let it make her stronger instead of bitter. She had a herd of 30 horses behind her, her own breeding stock, her own future, the continuation of the line that had started with Chogan's gift and been shaped by Dalton's vision and made beautiful by her own will. "I wanted you to see what we became," she said in Spanish, her accent now carrying the overtones of someone who'd lived between worlds and made a home in both. "From that moment when you said no, from that choice, this is what grew from it." Dalton, now in his 50s, weathered and silver-haired, looked at the horses and at the young woman who'd once been a bleeding, furious child, and understood the full weight of what had been redeemed in that moment beside the outlaw camp. It wasn't just a child's life. It was the possibility of generations. It was the knowledge that when you choose humanity, the echoes of that choice ripple forward in ways you can't predict or control. Only witness and honor. The territory would forget over time. History books wouldn't record it. School children would never learn the names of a cavalry officer and an Apache girl whose intersection had changed everything in that moment of refusal. But in the Arizona Territory in 1883, and in the years that followed, everyone knew. There was a man who'd chosen humanity over gold, and a girl who'd refused to be broken, and together they'd created something that defied the territory's logic. The desert itself seemed to honor that choice, granting him a peace that no amount of violence could have earned him, and granting her the freedom to become not a victim of history, but a maker of it. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor, and tell us in the comments. Would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.